So much ink has been spilled in the last 2,000 years trying to explain Jesus in this passage we have this morning of him up in the region of Tyre and Sidon. And as the gospel tells us, when asked for a miracle, Jesus, our Lord and Savior, turns on this woman and calls her a dog. Church does not like this story. It really doesn't. And there have been so many explanations offered to try to rehabilitate Jesus, justify Jesus, to try to put this in some kind of context so that we are not left with the hard story of Jesus turning on a woman whose daughter is demon-possessed and dismissing her by calling her a dog. Oh, well, you see, Jesus was just testing her faith. Well, that doesn't really work either, does it? I mean, I think, are there other ways to test people's faith other than just calling them bad names? Of course there are. And then, so that's a famous explanation. The other one is that Jesus is using this example to demonstrate the woman's faith, the idea that Jesus knows in advance what she's going to say. But here's the problem with all of these explanations. There are two fundamental problems with them. First of all of these explanations rely on information that's not in the text. There's nothing in the text that says Jesus is trying to make an example of her or some kind of demonstration of faith. There's none of that in the text. That's the first problem. The second problem is the text itself. There's no way around it. And so let's not go around it. Instead of trying to explain away Jesus' remark to this woman, let's take it seriously. Mark has included it in his gospel. We have it from Mark this morning. And let's talk about it. The first thing to note in all of this is that Jesus is very far from home. Let me give you a spoiler alert, just in case you're curious. We're not rehabilitating Jesus here, okay? We're not. There's no rehabilitating Jesus. Jesus calls this woman a dog. That's what happens, okay? So I don't want you to think, like, having said all this, I'm now going to somehow make this great arc, and then we come to the end and we realize, oh, it's really not so bad after all. Well, it really isn't so bad after all because of how it turns out, but there's no excusing Jesus' remark, and I'm not going to try to do that this morning. But what can you and I learn from this story? Well, there's a lot. There's a powerful story. Good reason that Mark includes it in his gospel. So, back to the narrative. The first thing to note is that Jesus is really far from home. And Mark gives us no explanation for what Jesus is doing way out of Judea and Galilee. He's in modern-day Syria. And so if we were to where the towns of Tyre and Sidon are. But it's ancient Phoenicia. Remember the Phoenicians? Remember the Phoenicians? We hear about the Phoenicians? Yes? Yeah? Okay. So it's the ancient land of the Phoenicians, and part of that too before, the Philistines. Remember the Philistines? Goliath and that crowd who harass Israel through much of the Old Testament, ancient enemies of Israel. So Jesus is really, really far from Galilee, far from Judea. And he's up on, it's actually a coastal town on the Mediterranean. My explanation as a seminarian student 25 years ago was that they went to the beach for the week. And that's why Jesus was up there. He and his guys, right, they needed a vacation. So, but again, to walk as they would have to get that far up But we're given no explanation, no reason for why Jesus is so far from home. But being so far from home, it seems odd that Jesus would expect to encounter anybody other than Gentiles. He's in the land of the Gentiles. Pretty much everything outside of the little province of Judea is all Gentiles. Okay? You've got the Israelites and Gentiles. They're everybody else. So when you're all the way up in Tyre and Sidon, up on the Mediterranean, it would be like Diane and I, who just spent a couple of weeks in England, expecting not to encounter English people. You would say, well, that seems awfully odd, as you are in England. And so that Jesus would not expect to encounter Gentiles is a little odd. It's a little odd, because that's where he is. But Mark does tell us in the gospel that Jesus is trying to fly under the radar, okay? Trying to fly under the radar, which in the land of the Gentiles, how many of them have heard about Jesus? How many of them know about Jesus? Well, certainly something of his fame has spread at least as far north as modern-day Syria, because there are people in town who both know that Jesus is there and have heard something about him. Something enough to make this woman come to seek him out, to ask him to heal her daughter. So she comes looking for Jesus. Now, from Jesus' perspective, she is, first of all, a woman. Strike one. It's true, Jenny, it's a strike. Strike one, she's a woman. Strike two, she's a Gentile. Syrophoenician woman. Somebody very far removed from Israel. Very far removed from Israel. Being a woman and being Syrophoenician, she's not an Israelite. She's not of the tribe of Israel. You're out. Strike three. And Jesus makes that abundantly clear. When she turns up and bows down in supplication and asks him to perform a miracle, something that Jesus has done over and over and over again. And Jesus says to her, I'm here to feed the children. I'm not going to waste the food on dogs. One thing I do appreciate about this story, among the many things I appreciate this story, is that this is a story that should theoretically keep us from romanticizing Jesus. One of the ways that we can disempower Jesus, that we can take the real Jesus Christ and kind of make him more palatable, make him easier, make him less of a challenge, is to romanticize the Jesus, right, the image of Jesus as the flower child, sort of skipping through the fields of Galilee and Judea, hugging people and throwing flowers and always with a kind thing to say. Well, it's just not the Jesus of the Gospels, okay? Jesus has an edge. Jesus has an edge. And do we see that edge today, right? He says to her, no, I'm not going to do that. But let's pause for a minute and think about this. When Jesus finally does capitulate, when Jesus finally does agree to heal this woman's child, to cast out this demon, what does he have to do? Do you remember in the story? There's nothing. It costs him nothing, right? He's able just with the word. He says to her, oh, go home, your child's healed. He didn't even have to leave the house. That's how easy it is for him. His command over the unclean spirits, they're helpless against him. He only has to say the word and they're gone. That's how easy it is for Jesus to cast out a demon, even in a young girl that's at a different location. So doesn't that sort of further deepen the question? It would have been easier for Jesus just to say, okay, go home, your child's healed, than to have to say, the food is for the Israelites, for the children, not for the dogs. All of this that he does say. You with me? You listening to this? Okay, right? It doesn't cost Jesus anything to heal this demon. So we need to take a step back. As we listen to this story, Jesus so far from home, up in the region of Tyre and Sidon, way up here in the land, I mean really in the land of Gentiles, in the land of Israel's ancient enemies. He's up here and he encounters this woman who is a Gentile, a real honest-to-goodness Gentile, and a woman. And what we learn is something already hinted at in the Gospels. What we learn is that at this point in his ministry, Jesus understands himself as belonging only to Israel. That Jesus himself is an Israelite. He's a Jew. He's Jewish. And he's raised as an Israelite. He's raised as a Jew. And he understands that that is his identity. And so he understands that his mission is, as he will phrase it in a different place, only to the lost sheep of Israel. And this makes sense from one perspective, because being an Israelite, being a Judean, a Jew, in the first century was a real identity. We've talked about this in other contexts, but in the Roman Empire, the Israelites, the Judeans, the Jews, had special privileges under Roman law. And so all throughout the Roman Empire and all of the great cities, there are synagogues, there are huge, thriving Jewish communities. And so having an identity as an Israelite, as a Jew, makes sense in the first century. And clearly, Jesus understands himself as not only an Israelite, the tribe of Israel, but his mission, his ministry, is only to the lost sheep of Israel. That Jesus understands at this point in his ministry that his teaching, his healing, the revelation of God acting through him is all about those people, the Israelites, who live in this covenanted relationship with God. And it's just for that. Those who live under the covenant of Torah. And so he sees himself acting within this religious tradition, within this religious practice. And we learn that Jesus is a good Jew. He prays, he can read, he knows Torah, he goes to Jerusalem for the festivals. And so at this point, especially right too in Jesus' polemic, his arguing, it's all about what it means to be a faithful Israelite, a faithful Jew. And so this, and again, I'm not excusing him. I'm contextualizing this, right? Who is this Gentile? Who is this woman? Who is this person? I've come all the way up here. I want to be by myself. She comes barging in, and he snaps back at her hard. He insults her. This is for the lost. This is my food. What I have to offer is for the lost sheep of Israel. Yeah? You think so? And then what does she say back at him? Say, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs from under the children's table. There's something remarkable that happens here. Jesus, in all of his verbal engagements throughout the Gospels, never loses a fight. Okay? In all of the verbal back and forth, Jesus is arguing with Pharisees. He's arguing with Sadducees. He's arguing with the scribes. He's arguing with whomever. He wins. He's got a comeback for everything. So much so that late in Jesus' ministry, there's that fabulous line, after that, no one dared ask him any questions. So in the verbal back and forth, the debating about righteousness and faithfulness, about the proper understanding of Torah, Jesus always wins, except one time. Jesus is only silenced once. And Jesus is silenced by this Syrophoenician woman. He's got no snappy comeback for her. He throws this abusive insult at her, and she catches it and throws it right back and hits him right between the eyes with it. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table. And Jesus can only say, well, for saying that, go ahead, your daughter's healed. That's all he's got. She bested him. She pulled the rug out from under him. And here's why this story is so crucial, and why this Syrophoenician woman, who, like almost all women in Holy Scripture, does not have a name, but nevertheless, we, those of us here this morning, owe her a great debt. We owe her a great debt. Because what we see then from this story forward, especially in Mark's gospel, is that Jesus now has a wider, more inclusive understanding of his mission in the world. Yeah, Jesus can learn. That's okay. It's okay to say that. Are you with me? Jesus can learn. It's okay for Jesus to learn. Jesus is learning. And what this woman helps Jesus understand is his mission, his ministry, the revelation of God acting through him is much bigger, much broader, much more inclusive than Jesus imagined. Jesus doesn't imagine at the outset of his ministry that his work will include the Gentiles, that his work will extend beyond the boundaries of Israel to the peoples of the world. And in this exchange, when we see Jesus at his worst, I don't think there's another passage where we see Jesus act quite as badly as he does in this interaction with this Syrophoenician woman. The insult he throws at her. So cruel. But he meets his match. He meets his match. She throws it right back at him. And I think when those words hit him between the eyes, his mind is opened. He now understands that what God is doing in and through Jesus is for the world. It's for the world. Wait a minute. I'm all the way up in Tyre. There should be no faith up here. It makes sense that Jesus might think, I'm not going to encounter faith up in Tyre, but that is exactly what he encounters. Not just faith, but an articulate and robust faith. This woman has tremendous courage in even coming to Jesus. I think, right, the desperation of wanting to care for her child drives her the way it so often does in the Gospels and brings her. And then, who knows what she thought she would expect, but I doubt she expected to be insulted, or maybe she did, I don't know. But nevertheless, she's ready. And Jesus experiences a profound demonstration of faith. Faith in God, faith in God revealed in Jesus Christ. And what her faith does is open Jesus' mind. It opens Jesus' mind. It expands his perspective. All of a sudden now Jesus is thinking, wait a minute, this is much bigger than I ever thought it was. Much, much bigger than I ever thought it was. So much so that when we get to the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will say to his apostles, go into all the world. Go to all the nations. Go to all people. And how does Jesus get from the go only, his earlier instruction to the apostles, go only to the lost sheep of Israel, to at the end of his ministry where the resurrected Christ now says, go to all the world, all the nations. How does he get from only Israel to all the world? Well, through Tyre. Through this Syrophoenician woman whose name we do not know, but whose response to Jesus in the face of an insult had a profound influence on Jesus himself. It had a profound influence on Jesus himself. And because of Jesus' growing self-awareness that his mission is to more than just the lost sheep of Israel, so we are all sitting here this morning. So we are all here. And this is what I meant when I said earlier, we owe this woman a debt. We owe her a debt. We owe those Gentiles in the Gospels who stood up to Jesus and challenged Jesus, taught Jesus something. The Roman centurion is another. We'll talk about him another time. But there are a couple of examples along the way, I think this one being the most profound, where Jesus has a deep and profound paradigm shift. And he now understands that who he is and what he is about is to the whole world. And here's the challenge, I think, for you and me. Here's the challenge for you and me. I would be willing to bet that if we all privately, quietly, look deeply into our hearts, we could identify those people that we believe are just dogs. If it really comes down to us, not our public face, right? Obviously, no, not our public face. But look deep into your heart. Who are for us the Syrophoenicians? Who are for us the Gentiles? Our bias, our prejudice, our judgment on other people. Do we, if we sincerely, I mean us here, do we, if we sincerely examine our hearts, do we think of some people as dogs, as not worthy of God's grace, not worthy of God's mercy, not worthy of God's love, not worthy of our care, not worthy of our concern? When we hear that they are suffering, do we think to ourselves, good, they deserve it? Because this passage invites us to think about this and to ask that hard question and to remember when Jesus identifies this woman as a dog, she in turn reveals to her her profound humanity and her deep faith. And Jesus is the one who is corrected. Jesus is the one who learns and who grows. And so this story is an invitation and a caution. An invitation for you and me to search our hearts. And if we're truthful, do we identify those people we might just dismiss as dogs? That's the first piece. The second piece is, if that is the case, be prepared. Be prepared to have their humanity, their faith thrown right back at us.